class, we're going to be talking about the second part of the Phillips and Weaver text that we're going to cover. It's the British school. So we talked about the American school in the last lecture. We talked about positivism. We talked about empiricism. We talked about being quantitative, right? Using the numbers, the data. We'll actually talk about data again and why data is different from fact. And then a lot of the American school follows what's called ceteris paribus. So if we take everything else equal, and that is a economist's behavior, it's a mechanism, right? This is where we get humans are interchangeable. So let's treat everything else as equal, and then we won't have to deal with individual personalities, right? We can just treat them all, okay, if everything else was equal, this is how they would behave. So it gives us a lot of predictive power. But what the British school, one of the biggest things they talk about is it doesn't really get everything. It's not contextual. It doesn't get all of the nuance. The other part is that the American school deals with small questions, right? This is called problem-solving theory. So you have an issue, right? We're dealing with issues right now. How do we solve those problems, right? How do we get the supply chain more functional, right? How can we make sure that things are on the shelves when we go to the store to buy them? How can we make sure that people aren't hoarding and price gouging, right? These are problem-solving issues. So we call this in political science policy relevant, right? You always want to be policy relevant because you want someone to be able to respond to what your research is doing, right? Some of you have done conflicts like the Iraq War or femicide, right? What do you want the government to do based on your research, right? What changes do you want to see? Do we think the Kurdish nation should be a state? Do we think that international involvement is required for femicide in Mexico? So when we talk about these issues that you guys have been governing, and we'll talk about, I have a separate section, separate recording I'll do for the papers. You want to have a policy that you would like to see implemented. So it's functional, but when we talk about the British school, they'll talk about a lot of problems with this approach. The first one is that there's no prescription, right? That in the British school, it's normative. There are oughts and shoulds. Things should be a certain way. You have a lot of philosophers in this field, right? So when we talk about Immanuel Kant, what so much of you have mentioned, right? Humans have intrinsic value. They have a value in and of themselves. So if you want to include that, you're drifting into the British school, right? If they have value, we have to treat them in some way because they're humans. That drifts into the British school of IPE. The other part is it's a different ontology, right? It's not empirical, right? It's not just the world exists and let's measure it. There's a lot of intersubjective, right? We can go all the way back to when we talked about Ruggie, right, embedded liberalism, that there's this programmatic language, this generative grammar, where the words we use start to take meaning, and because they start to take meaning, we don't talk about certain things, right? Femicide is a new term, right? When we didn't really have a term for it, we just talked about violence in general. But violence against women is different from violence in general. So the language that we use starts to shape the way we perceive things. And if perception is what we're basing our world on, right, the nature of our world is perception based, then those languages, those terms, they really start to matter. The next part is qualitative, right? You can't just reduce everything to numbers if you need this nuance, if you need norms to be in behavior, right? You don't know the numerical impact of a norm, but you know that it has an impact, right? And sometimes when we're talking about qualitative, is impact, right? Responsibility to protect had an impact, but do we know in the number of deaths, right? Can we count how much impact it has? Not really. So we have to do a lot of this. The next part is context matters, right? And I'm using Mexico and Korea for examples. They both have, second-tier economies, and I don't mean second-tier as like underdeveloped. I mean, they're not China or the US, right? But they have solid economies. They're growing. They've improved. They've industrialized, right? They're an advanced economy, right? There's a lot of factors that's going through this, but if you look at the way that Korea develops and the way that Mexico develops, very, very different, right? The historical knowledge matters. The other part is some of you might see why this is unacceptable to sort of compare them, right? And a British school would say, like, okay, are you comparing Mexico and Korea? But what about the difference between Mexico and Korea, right? Korea is next to China. China is very isolationist, has been very isolationist, is not intervening as much. Mexico is close to the United States, right? It has a lot of involvement with the US, and the US behavior is different from the Chinese behavior. So they're in a different context. And that's not even counting the cultural differences, the historical differences, right? the environmental differences, right? Korea is actually quite cold, right? And, right, Mexico has a warmer condition. There are different factors, right, where they're positioned, right? Korea is very small in its landmass. So there are all of these qualitative aspects that you need to know, and this is called historical knowledge. The other part about the British school is it asks really big questions. And by really big questions, we need transformation, which we'll talk about in a minute. So historical knowledge is this counter to positivism coming from the British school. So positivism is you're on the outside looking in, right? You're objective. You're, okay, I'm looking at this, what is happening. Historical knowledge occurs within a context. So the language, the culture, environment. What about the culture? What about the language? What about that behavior that changes, right? On Thursday, we read a paper, you have these individual personalities that behave very differently, but their backgrounds matter, right? So there's this difference. On 121 of the text, right, they talk about the specific social and temporal context. So social is these rules, right? What are your societal rules? What are your norms? And then there's a temporal factor. And this is something that we have to really think about when we're doing theory in IPE and through the British school. At what date are you talking about this, right? What is the date in the context of that date, right? What's the technology exist? What's the culture like? What's the regime? Remember that it wasn't just economic advancements that Susan Strand was talking about, but political and social advancements. The Greek Republic is very different from the American Republic. So you have advancements not just in technology, but also in society, right? Society is different. You have societal advancements that go along with this. And then when we talk about regime, who gets to be in power? What are the rules about those people in power? If we're talking about women's rights in the beginning of the 20th century, we're talking about suffrage. We're talking about giving them the right to vote. And we're talking about women's rights in the 21st century, right? In the sort of last 10 years, we're talking about a very different behavior. We're talking about recognition of their social structure that's keeping them down. We're talking about recognition of individuals who are sort of doing inappropriate things, right, illegal things, and catching up with some of these crimes. So the time that we're talking about, the temporal factor really matters. And sometimes when we're talking temporal factor, we can talk about an artifact, something that only applied, and we'll talk about that when I use an example in a minute. So there is the difference between data and fact. And so this is part of this historical knowledge aspect. So a datum is singular is the singular of data, right? It's something observable, right? If you had apples, right, you could count them 1, 2, 3. That's an observable piece of data, right? I have 3 apples, right? One singular datum. It is classified. So I have decided what apples are. I've coded it in, right? An apple, a unit of apples is 1 apple, right? Or it could be a pound of apples or whatever it is, depending on your, right? We're talking economically, so it could be a ton of apples, whatever it is. But you're also classifying apples very specifically, right? You're only talking about apples that are for some reason, right? You're talking about Granny Smith or whatever the other types of apples are, right? You're talking about this type of apple and 1 unit of that measurement. A fact is very different because a fact is made by a human mind. So whenever you're talking about a fact, it is intersubjective at best, right? It might just be subjective. You said, well, I believe this to be true. That's subjective, right? If you believe something to be true, you subjectively make that a fact, right? This is the problem with facts and truth that we've talked about a little bit in the semester, is that a fact is made by someone and it goes through an individual process. And we have to consider the rationale behind that and the bias behind it. So first, right, I'm a rational choice proponent, so I'm very biased, right? So I would say if I can't explain it in a sort of cost-benefit analysis, then for me it's not rational. But that's my bias, right? That doesn't mean that's the only process, that's my bias. The other part is that I rationalize through the cost of things, right? What is the cost of a certain behavior, right? I particularly don't talk to my family that much, but I know that never talking to my family is a bad idea. So I weigh out how often I should talk to them, which how much time it takes to talk to them. So that seems very sociopathic, but to the point, right? That's my thought process, that the fact is you need to have family in your life, so you need to put in a certain amount of time commitment. And because you need to put in that certain amount of time commitment, that's the rationale that I have between what it means to engage in and interact with a family. For someone else, right, that rationale will be very different, right? Family is important because it is family, right? That leads into tautologies a little bit, right? This sort of circular logic. But, right, that might be something different, right? Everyone has a family. That's my fact, right? But that's coming from a human mind. So when we're talking about facts, every fact is based on, right? Every argument is based on somebody. So what's their bias? How do we see their bias, and what's their behavior? The other part about the British school, it is much more concerned about transformation. So the American school, we only talk about things that are happening today. Whereas in the British school, we're talking about how things change from one system to another. So economic changes force societal change. So human life just changes. The first thing that we can talk about in the 20th century is this idea of specialization. It used to be that you did everything, right? If you had a job, you were the butcher, the baker, the sort of washer, you did all of the work. And then in the 20th century, we see this thing called specialization. I'm only an instructor, right? If you have a job as a cop, you're only a cop. You also don't do other things. So specialization starts to change our human behavior because as we specialize, our interactions actually increase, right? You need to go talk to the butcher for meat if you eat meat. You need to go talk to, right, a city councilman or a bureaucrat if you need a permit. You need to go talk to all of these people, right? The mechanic, the computer engineer. All of these people have different specializations, which means you become more interactive, right? Your community and your network becomes much larger because everyone does something different and everyone starts to fill a different role. And then as humans, we start to treat people as if they fill different roles, right? Your friends have different roles, your romantic partners, everyone has a different role and it's very specialized. And your society behaviors. This comes from Susan Strange, right? And her concern is, will we really have a shift between economic and societal change, right? Will political governments actually catch up to these economic advancements? Because economy, right, the economic integration is just running rampant, right? You have multinational corporations, you have European integration, you have all of these things. So this economic behavior is running off because of technology. Will society really catch up? And I want to use this example of an innovation, right? So some of you have heard this story before, right? In New York, there's this concern about manure, right? You don't have cars yet. It's the turn of the 20th century, right? The beginning of the 20th century. And the concern is that as the population is growing, you will likely see feet high levels of manure if we continue on this process because you need so many horses, and how do we get rid of this manure? And so what we think as a society is, oh, we have this problem, we need to start finding a way to deal with all of this manure. And then in 1910, you have this huge shift with the automobile, right? The automobile comes into existence and it just eliminates this problem. And this is this huge economic shift because an automobile changes how far you're able to go for shopping, for business, right? Transportation changes, right? But also you need all this infrastructure, you need roads, you need highways, right? These projects come into play in the 1920s and 1930s for the US. But then all of a sudden society changes. You're no longer connected to your local community as much because you can travel outside of your local community. So this innovation just dramatically changes the world. And the problem that we thought we had, right, this problem of waste, stops being a problem and we change. We change so dramatically that the old problem doesn't exist anymore because our lifestyle doesn't engage in horse travel as much, right? And then eventually not at all. So innovation can change our lives entirely, right? We can change dramatically. Right now we're having an online class, unheard of in the 1980s, impossible. So this behavior changes our society because of what we can do with that technology. It also creates in the 20th century this new social strata. So until the 20th century, you don't really have an industrial revolution that's as big, right? This is happening in the 19th, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and it introduces the labor class, right? For those of you who read the Communist Manifesto or have looked up Marxism, right? It's this difference between the proletariat, the working people, and the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie, those who own the resources, right? Owners and employees, right? Employee-employer relationships, and it creates these new grievances. So now you have a labor class that's struggling, right, that may not be able to have as much as they want, and you have this owners that are just very, very wealthy. And it changes the way we see governments. governments start to be required to have a response to this lack of wealth, right, or this income inequality. And we see this problem today in the US, right? Income inequality is massive, right? Wealth inequality is massive in the US. In the 20th century, what we saw is all of these new, right, behaviors by government, right? All of a sudden, government was going to start taking from those extremely wealthy and giving to the poor, right? So this became a shift in our social behavior, but it was only possible because of the Industrial Revolution. So nationalism also becomes part of this, right? If you're part of a labor force in, the Southeast, right? If you're in Alabama and you're part of this working group and Taiwan is making your product cheaper, right? Then you're going to want to have some protections, right? This labor competition and international trade starts to matter. And originally what we had was called laissez-faire, right? Where you just didn't really intervene and you let everyone compete. But what we see is that a lot of places are able to compete because they do things that can't be done, right? And this is part of the problem. Why do American companies outsource so much, right? Because you can't legally do the type of labor that you have in other parts of the world that you see that you could have in the US, right? US requires more protections. It requires higher paying people, right? Even though you save on transportation, even though that, right, you can locally source, right, most companies start outsourcing, and then what you see is the introduction of Keynesian protections, right? This is where you really promote global trade, right? We want everyone to trade globally, but I want to protect my labor force. So a lot of times it's very specific, right? I'm going to protect furniture makers in the Southeast, right? So any furniture that comes in from outside of the United States has to have a tax on it, right? And that helps protections for your labor force. And this is a huge shift, and because you start having these different outgroups, all of a sudden it's easier to be nationalist, right? Because trade matters, because all of a sudden state borders matter, now you can start having an outgroup that is another national identity. And so nationalism is actually an outcropping of the 20th century change into international trade, because you can have an outgroup, right? You can, right, it's only in the 20th century that Americans can care about the type of products that are coming out of Japan, because they're finally able to compete because the technology has made it possible for Japan to sell cars to the United States. So this new technological invention creates this new social innovation, and then nationalism becomes part of that. Before all this technology, it'd be very unlikely that you would have the same level of national identity. So then the next part is what British School is talking about, is this great transformation, right? How do we have a great transformation? This is a text by Polanyi in 1957, right? Where it's like, okay, how does the world just shift, right? The world just shifts with the automobile. When you have the internet come out, right? Computers, right? They change the world dramatically, economically first, and then politically. So how do we look at that? We're going to look at historical trends, and we're going to look at cases in the world. So a lot of times when we look at cases in the world, right, New York's this great example because it's this huge sort of economic center, and then the automobile comes around and then the whole world changes where it becomes a global center, right? So you have this historical trends, these transformations matter because life in these urban areas change so dramatically with these advancements. Now, the reason the British school is so critical of the American school is because models always abstract, right? You always abstract out. So no matter what theory you're looking at, you always abstract a little from reality, right? When we talk about realism, they're like, yes, we abstract from reality, but we're the closest to reality, so we're going to call ourselves realism. So whenever you have a theory, you're going to abstract, and then formal models, right? The American school goes through formal models, and what they do is they follow this process where they create a universe. So we're like, okay, only these things are in the universe, right? Only great powers are in the universe. Realism's problem, right? There are only great powers in the universe. It's a self-help system, and the system's anarchic, right? I'm giving my universe rules, right? When realism makes these assumptions about this, they're creating a world in which these things hold. And then if it doesn't, right, if it doesn't really apply, right, if it's a small state or a weak state or Costa Rica that doesn't have a military, right, those aren't really in my universe. My universe of cases only includes great powers from realism. If I'm rational choice, it only includes cost-benefit analysis. And if someone's using a different thought process, I'm like, oh, you don't apply to my model, right? Now, this is the problem that Susan Strange talks about. If it's not in the model, we just ignore it. That's a problem because there are a lot of things that aren't in your model. So instead of that, the British school follows this idea of shipbuilding, right? So you don't have any exclusions, right? You include everything. You don't have any direct goals, so no imperatives, right? So you're like, okay, I think this is how the world works, and I'm going to draw on anthropology and sociology and psychology and history, and I'm going to put this all together, and then I'm going to see, right? I'm going to see, does this work in the past? Do people behave this way in the past? Do they behave this way in the future? Do they behave this way across this timeline? And then what happens when the theory fails, right? Where do I hit a problem? Right, Costa Rica is this example that we always use because for a period of time it had a defense force, but it didn't have an army. There was no reason for it not to have an army. It just chose that it didn't want to spend the money on a standing military and instead scaled that back to a defense force so that it could spend more money on services. So for a lot of realists, that doesn't make any sense. You're basically giving up, right? You're like, okay, no one's going to invade us anyways, right? That's not a survival behavior. So it violates that. So that theory fails. So why does it fail? Why is Costa Rica special, right? So shipbuilding is this, okay, I built this idea, I have this idea that I want to see if it works, and I'm just going to see if it works everywhere in different times. So this is not hypothesis testing in America, right? In the American school, right, we have a scientific method, right? And we've talked about this a lot, so I know I'm going quickly, but I want to get this out to you, and we're already behind. So you need something testable, right? I need something that I can observe and measure, but I also need something falsifiable, right? So the scientific method always involves falsifiability, right? There has to be the possibility that I'm wrong, right? There always has to be the possibility that I'm wrong. That's why it's scientific, because I'm not saying this is true, I believe it to be true. I'm saying this is what the evidence supports, and I'm going to keep testing it. And if new evidence comes in that says this is wrong, then I change that behavior. When you're doing hypothesis testing, when you're taking a scientific method, you only need to deal with what's happening now. It doesn't have to be good forever, right? Even when we talk about gravity, right? Gravity is very scientific. It only applies on the surface of the Earth, right? When we talk about you fall at 32 feet per second, right? Whatever, even if that's inaccurate. You are talking about this applies today on the center of our Earth, on near the surface of the Earth, right? That's a testable hypothesis because you can drop something and see how fast it falls, right? Well, how fast it accelerates, for those of you that are scientists. So I'm not, right, dealing with, right, if I'm doing stock market evaluation, I'm like, okay, what did people behave like before the stock market exists? I'm not worried about what happens next year. I'm going to try and predict how the stock market will function this year, right? If I'm a stock market, right, analyst right now, I'm saying, okay, we're expecting economies to open up next month. We should see certain businesses ramp up faster, right? For those of you, because we live in Las Vegas, right? If economies start to open up, when Las Vegas opens up, we should expect a lot of travel. People have been cooped up, right? We know that after they've been cooped up for a while, they're going to want to go out. So the casinos are going to be very busy, or they may not, depending on how cautious people are, right? But there's just likely going to be this uptick in companies, right? It's a scientific process. We're only testing what happens now, right? And that's a different behavior. The last thing is we've talked about an American school and a British school, but we don't want to treat them as sort of monoliths, right? They're not all one thing. So what happens in a school is, in the American school specifically, you get this conformity of thought, right? We've talked about this in epistemic communities. You set rules, you professionalize, right? There's only one way to do something, and then we get to what's called best practices. Now, if you can't tell, I hate this term. Best practices is that there's a certain way to do things, right? There's only one way to do things. This is the right way to do things. Now, notice I'm saying right. That's a normative argument, right? For American school, it's very problematic because we don't deal in normative, but we have such conformity of thought in the American School of IPE that we're like, this is the way that you do things, right? You build a theory, you look at the data, you test that hypothesis, right? There's very little else in the behavior. If you look at the top journals, right, it's always, I found this data, I ran a regression, here's the results I got. And even if your theory and your argument's not very good, if your results are good, then you get published. So it's this behavior that we have, right? Conformity of thought in a school, right? We know how to behave in certain ways. Now, the other parts about a school, right, that happen in the American school status quo defenders. If you're in the American School of IPE, one of your jobs is to make sure the US stays in its position of power, right? If you're like, okay, we predict that China will rise, right? what can we do to stop China's rise above the US, right? You have a job in the American School of IP to just sort of defend the US sort of economic powerhouse as it is. If you're a local sort of, if you're in other parts of the world, right, if you're China, right, we're going to toss out, okay, what are our, and when we talk about British and American school, right, British school is those who study in Britain, go to British universities, American school, those who are in American universities, but they're not, like their ethnic background, their, where they originally came from, that's not really relevant, right? These are schools of thought, but the people themselves are very, very diverse. So if you're in the British school, you don't have that rule. So you might be talking about the rise of the rise of Chinese culture as it impacts the international society, right? But American school would say, okay, well, we expect the Chinese government, right, doesn't have the backing, right, or the U.S. has certain other characteristics. This is actually a little bit of a bias, right, because you're trying to see those things. Now, outside of the American British School, you have other schools, right? It's just we only really deal with the English-speaking world because very few political scientists speak enough languages that they could sort of pull from different worlds. What we do see is sort of in the Russian context, right? There's this idea that history is not really cyclical, right? That you can't just expect Russia to rise to great power naturally, right? That there has to be will, right? It's very constructivist agency. So a lot of these countries are like, well, the system the way it is, we're not going to do anything. So what we need to do is work on it. We need to embrace this and push ourselves through, right? So if history is not cyclical, then we can change it. So that's a school, right? You have this shared thought through these universities, through these exchanges, right? You talk to the same professors, it's the same names, the same journals a lot. So you're getting these things and it leads to a best practice. So these are two different schools, the American school and the British school. And I'm going to go back to this slide at the end, right? You need to know the difference between the American and the British school, right? You need to know the differences. You need to know the difference between positive and normative, empirical and intersubjective, right? Quantitative, qualitative. We've actually talked about this a lot, right? This is why I brought them up over and over again. And I want you to know these differences and understand these two schools because this is going to make up the majority of your final, the final exam that we do. It's not cumulative, it's just the last exam. And we'll talk about that in a separate video. Thank you.